Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to ETE 2020. We're going to get the afternoon kicked off with our next session, Building a Digital Treasury Strategy, with our presenter, Edmund Glasnap. We do have a couple of quick reminders. Again, all attendees will be placed on mute for the duration of the presentation. Any questions can be submitted via the chat to panelists or the Q&A. A recording of this session, as well as a copy of the PDF slides, will be available via a digital library following the event. And this session is eligible for those CTP CCM credits. So a link to that assessment will be sent out during the Q&A as well as with the follow-up slides. Our presenter for this afternoon, Mr. Edmund Glasnap, is our Treasury Advisory Services Practice Lead at Elire. He has over 9 years of experience in project management, treasury management systems, business process design, data analysis, and system configuration. He helps clients standardize and enhance their treasury management systems by upgrading their treasury operations into cloud-based TMS solutions. With that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Edmund.
Thank you, Jordan. Appreciate the nice intro. Hi, everyone. Welcome. As Jordan said, my name is Edmund Glasnap. I'm the Treasury Advisory Practice Lead. And today's presentation, I'm going to be reviewing one of the tools that Elire uses to building a digital treasury strategy. So let's get started. So quick overview of what we're going to be doing today. So we'll do a quick overview of Elire's treasury experience. I know that a lot of you probably have attended other sessions, so we're not going to be, spending a ton of time there. But once we get through that, I'll introduce the concept of process maturity and how it relates to today's treasury environment, processes, technology, and maturity enablers. Then I'll dive into the process maturity model and the enablers that drive process maturity. And to do this, I've tried to find a use case to identify with. And these enablers include design, metrics, owners, performance, and infrastructure. And ultimately, we will end the session with how maturity analysis and strategic planning work together and the best practices for moving forward. So our experience, as you've probably heard during this ETE event, Elire celebrating 15 years. And we're a full service consulting firm, foundation in treasury advisory and technology implementation. So that was one of the things that we started out with. We serve as a trusted advisor. We help our clients by partnering effectively with them to implement software. We also have partnered with TMS solutions like Kyriba and FIS. And we've always been in close ties and partnership with Oracle. And we are also a Swift Ready partner. We provide strategic guidance and best practices along all core processes, and we have a deep commitment to excellence and quality. Some of the practices that fall within Treasury for us is obviously what my practice, Treasury Advisory Services, but my practice really leads and speaks to ERP implementations when it comes to Treasury services, cloud implementations, and obviously, we provide managed services to our treasury clients and help support their systems as well. Something that I like to share, and you've probably seen, and we won't spend a ton of time here, but our NASCAR slide. These are some of our many clients where we've implemented successful projects. What's nice here is that I can truly say that I've been involved in a lot of these projects, and we've built a lot of really awesome relationships with these clients through different implementations or services we've provided to them. But you know what? That's enough about Elire. Let's move on and dive into the fun stuff, an introduction to process maturity and treasury. Okay, so something you might have seen a lot this week. Each session had a treasury word cloud that represented some of the topics or buzzwords related to that presentation. We had presentations around strategy, we had product demos, and a lot of topics have been thrown out there. these word clouds are a fun way to visualize all the interesting things we've discussed this week. But in reality, they also, at least for me, sometimes represent how chaotic things can get when you got all these different topics and buzzwords thrown at you. And so, I'm coming from a perspective of, if we have the right tools to build a treasury strategy, you can actually turn some of this chaos into order. So another visual that I hope is familiar to everyone is the day in the life of the treasury manager. This is cool for me because I've seen this visual actually evolve over the years at Elire. But this is how Elire sees treasury. And this is how I would argue a treasurer wants to operate, right? With clear and precise processes that are defined, organized, and within reach. So treasury technology today, where we were and where we are. Earlier this year, I was lucky enough to do a presentation with Steve Wiley, a strategic director at FIS. And part of that presentation focused on how and what technology was pushing the needle in 2020. We discussed artificial intelligence, next generation cybersecurity, RPAs, APIs, real-time treasury, and to a certain extent, all of these things drive performance within your treasury. But he correctly argued that when looking at the 2020 economic environment and all the chaos that's been going on this year, some of the more foundational elements of treasury remained in the forefront of all the treasury managers. And really what that means to us is a focus on risk management, on cloud-based automation, working capital, global liquidity mobilization, global bank connectivity. These are all things that remain and are extremely critical elements that ultimately drive performance within Treasury. And so let's pull this back to the Treasury process maturity. So there are 5 critical enablers of process performance. We need to look at design, specifications of the work activities in the process, metrics, how the process is measured, baselined, and how improvements are determined. Owners, we need to look at who is accountable and in charge of the process. Performers, who is actually executing the work? What are their skills, knowledge, and attitude towards the processes? That's also a really important piece. And infrastructure, we need to look at the information systems and the technology that support those processes. One of the most important concepts that I think everyone needs to take away from this presentation today is simply that you can't always focus solely on technology and information systems to solve your treasury process pain points. A lot of the solutions that we see are technology based, but the reality is, especially when we're in an environment where we're moving to cloud, we have to look at our processes and the people and the things behind those processes. Wherever you're at, you need to consider all the enablers for pushing the needle within your own treasury. So how is process maturity measured? So maturity is measured along a continuum. Some processes might be informal, unorganized with chaotic results, no defined process. Some processes might be functional and operate consistently. These are reliable, predictable, manageable processes. Some processes might be standardized and high performing. They consist of end-to-end designs. Some processes might be collaborative and integrate with other processes throughout your organization. and some processes might be leading. These extend outside of your company and extend to all the suppliers and yield world-class results. As you can clearly see, we've defined various points on the continuum that allow you to measure where you are now and ultimately where you want to be. So let's dive into the process maturity model. And so what I've done here is I'd like to review a few use cases that I hope can help create an understanding of each enabler. So design, energy company use case. Here's a quick overview of the use case in the project. Objectives were to improve the procure-to-pay business processes, expand the use of purchase orders, standardize those processes. We also looked at automating accounts payable, simplifying payment requests, and streamlining approvals. An indirect result of the project was the positive downstream impact to Treasury processes. So when we look at what drove maturity for Treasury, ultimately by isolating those critical P2P processes and taking the time to build end-to-end designs for purchasing, accounts payable, and pay cycle, we didn't just see improvements in the P2B processing, but we also saw improvements in upstream Treasury processes, specifically around forecasting and reporting. And so this was a good example of how looking at the design of all the processes around Treasury or that fed into Treasury ultimately helped existing Treasury processes. And ultimately, it led to a collaborative business process for P2B and Treasury. So one of my favorite topics or enablers, I guess, is metrics. And so a health, nutrition, marketing use case that I have here. This started out primarily as a project that focused on the feasibility of implementing an in-house bank. The objectives consisted of an 8-week roadmap. We aimed to align resources and business processes, define their specific roles. We did current state analysis on their business processes. We did a disconnect assessment, and we did workshops and current state mapping. And ultimately, we defined best practices, identified best practice solutions for them. In the scope of the Treasury scope of this, we were focusing on FX exposure reporting, intercompany transactions, hedge accounting and automation, cash pooling. We also looked at POBO and ROBO activities that were very critical when looking at in-house banking, and also cash forecasting. And so what are the maturity drivers for metrics? So during this engagement, we focused on Treasury process metrics and determined that there was a lot of opportunity for improvement. Most processes did not necessarily have metrics defined to track errors or operational performance. So, even though we were able to identify processes that we wanted to tackle and processes that would really drive what type of in-house banking solution we would pick, we didn't have a lot of metrics to start off with. But by adding these processes could be baselined and improved based on comprehensive data. So the idea here is, if you have a process but you can't measure it, right, you're ultimately not going to be able to baseline anything and see where you are and where you want to be. This type of engagement we also looked at other types of metrics, right? We went outside and looked at industry metrics that we needed to look at. We also looked at ROI of existing solutions, and all of this really drove best practice solutions ultimately. and provided a lot of value. So what type of treasury metrics do we actually look at? Here are some examples of KPIs that can be very beneficial when assessing your processes. When I think of like error rates and I think of accuracy of cash forecasts, accuracy of forecasted investment income, accuracy of forecasted interest expense. And so for operational performance, we can also look at time required for determining daily cash position versus a benchmark, a ratio of system generated payments versus manual payments. These are things that we can look at operational versus just looking at error rates of our data. For debt management, we might look at measuring all-in rates versus a benchmark. For exposure management, we might look at trade exposure variances. For liquidity cash management, we might focus on actual versus forecasted variances. These are all solid metrics, and there's a lot of metrics out there. And by the way, AFP is a great resource. I've done a lot of research on this, and there's a lot of nice stuff out there that people have put out there. And these are the types of metrics that you can really pull into your existing processes and ultimately drive performance within your treasury. So let's look at the owner's enabler. Here's a finance broker-dealer use case. So the objectives of this project involved implementing complex interfaces with the external source systems. Now, the reason that was so complex and we needed all these external source systems is ultimately this broker-dealer, this big client with a lot of transaction activity needed to replace a legacy application. And that involves, the objectives there involve reducing costs and adding functionality within a new application, migrating regional business units into the new application infrastructure, aligning business processes and functionality to meet regulatory environments, and most importantly, allow US operations to take ownership of global business units and align those with regulatory environments. At the time, there was a lot of Dodd-Frank activity happening, and the regulatory environment was changing dramatically. So this was very critical to align those business processes and the ownership of those processes within the organization. And so what are the maturity drivers that we look at with owners? We need to have owners identified and aligned with activities and the level of authority for those business processes that those owners have. By doing this, in this engagement, we saw US Treasury operations become the primary owner of payment disbursements and align itself and integrate with other source systems, and develop strategic planning for all payment disbursement processes. So they went from, they were able to increase performance around payment disbursement because they were able to clearly identify who was going to take ownership, identify the activities, specific activities that belonged to those owners, and have a clear definition of the level of authority there. And so as a result, we saw comprehensive collaboration with other teams, and US operations had full control over the processes, the technology, and the change initiatives within that process. So let's look at performers. So this use case is a real estate and warehousing use case. It was an in-house banking implementation with objectives. The objectives were, so this was an 8-month effort from mobilization all the way to deployment. The scope included facilitated workshops, analysis of cash activity. We looked at payables and receivables and COBO and robo activities, obviously with that. And we looked at also administration processes around accounts and entities. And part of what we also looked at was design of process and requirements for the system. And we also had to look at and specifically focus on the knowledge of the resources who are actually performing the activity. And remember, performers are, unlike owners, are the resources who are actually executing the activity, actually executing the processes. So in this case, one of the things that we truly prioritized during this initiative, during this engagement, and ended up being one of the biggest drivers of performance, was how we train the performers executing the activities. So we developed 13 different training documents to support the people and their understanding of the new system and processes within that system. And we leverage existing resources and expertise to identify best practice. At the end of the day, because we prioritize those people and we prioritize the level of training that they needed, Treasury truly ended up seeing a huge increase in performance. So moving on, infrastructure. So this was an example of a reinsurance industry. So this use case really focused on ultimately taking a client from an on-prem system to a cloud-based system. And that process involved an RFP selection and a cloud TMS implementation ultimately. It started with a roadmap. We aligned resources and business processes. We had to accommodate an aggressive timeline with a lot of resource constraints. And there were, lots of more complex business requirements around regional constraints and resources. And there were a lot of siloed applications and user groups that we had to navigate. But part of the scope when we looked at all this was bank account admin, bank statement reporting and recon. We looked at a lot of cash positioning and cash accounting controls that needed to be in place, and ultimately payment processing acknowledgements. And so really what drives infrastructure, best practice solution really ultimately is here. We really needed to have clear, first of all, access to all the users and really have clear requirements for their infrastructure. And so again, lots of times I see a lot of focus on infrastructure only because that's what we're seeing out in the market when we talk about Treasury performance and Treasury processes. It's a lot is driven by technology, and ultimately an infrastructure maturity driver needs to have very clear requirements defined. And so again, I want to reinforce the idea that all the enablers are equally as important when we're looking at this, but ultimately we need to be able to look at everything all together to drive performance. So again, to summarize this model, remember we got design, metrics, owners, performance, and infrastructure. And again, a lot of times we only end up focusing on the last one, infrastructure. And maybe elements of design, metrics, owners, and performers. But this idea that we need to evaluate all of them together to really push the needle to increase our treasury performance is really what I'm trying to reinforce. And so again, to summarize and to revisit this, how you measure yourself ultimately comes down to looking at whether your processes are informal, are they functional, do you have standardized processes that are end-to-end? How collaborative are your processes with other systems and other departments? And ultimately, maybe you want to strive to be a leading, you want all your processes to be leading and extend outside the company. So this is how you have to kind of approach this. You need to evaluate where you are and where you want to be. So using maturity analysis in strategic planning. So how do we use maturity analysis in strategic planning? So again, remember we want to keep our treasury processes in mind, and we want to make sure that we want them to be clear, we want them to be precise, defined, organized, and within reach. And again, you know, as a treasury manager, you might have more emphasis on one process more than the other. But one way or another, you need to consider how each process is working with each enabler. Whether that's simply just setting up new accounts in a TMS system, or whether it's more administrative pieces around setting up new accounts. You know, you want to look at how are the processes designed when it comes to cash forecasting. Do we have those processes clearly defined somewhere? Or is it just something that people do on the fly? Those things are really critical to think about. You know, when we look at how our payment systems are integrated throughout all of our information systems, not just within a TMS. Do we have clearly defined end-to-end processing that ties all these systems together, or do we just have it designed and defined for one section or one system? You know, these are the types of elements that we look at. When it comes to sending payments to the bank, do we have a lot of manual transactions associated with a certain system or business process? Or do we have a lot of automated payments for different processes? These are things that we need to look at. We need to look at the design. How do you measure performance when it comes to sending payments? You know, how many manual payments are we executing? How many, you know, are automated? How many systems require complex workflow? All these things need to be considered. And, you know, more complex treasury processes that involve hedging and investments in debt, are the performers' knowledge, are their knowledge and skills, do those meet the level of need for those processes, right? Who owns those processes? Is they clearly defined? Who's accountable and who's executing those processes? These are the things that really matter once we look at treasury. So let's move on to how we can kind of visualize everything. So process maturity, evolution, like, so how do we get to, once we've identified where we are, how do we get to where we want to be? And so the first thing that can truly help understand how to tie this all together is to visualize the treasury maturity analysis itself. you have you have it can take a while to gather the data. It can, you might have to really review all your current state processes, but um, ultimately the best way to kind of break this down is to find some way to visualize things. So once we've identified all the Treasury processes that we want to look at, and maybe we've done some level of internal analysis, maybe there's been some kind of engagement where there's a current state analysis required, and so you have a project that identifies all your current processes. Once you've done that level, you can lay that out. And then once you've understood how or what the best way is to measure those processes, and remember, we've laid out this continuum on how you can evaluate your maturity, right, when it comes to each one of your processes. And so you can lay this out and have visual representations of where you are and where you want to be. So thinking of cash forecasting, a lot of times if you're coming from maybe a legacy system that's an on-prem, you might be sitting kind of at a functional level when it comes to those processes. But maybe once you evaluate where you are and you are able to understand where you want to be, then you could maybe move that and push that needle to be more collaborative. And again, to do that, you have to ultimately focus on all 5 enablers. And again, some processes, when you do this type of analysis, that ultimately will drive your strategic planning overall, some processes might not necessarily need to move. If you have intercompany transactions and the processes that fall within that category are standardized, they might not need to go further out than that. That might not be a priority really for your organization, right? Now, I can tell you that, if you're a global company and you have many business units and there's a need to implement in-house banking solution, your intercompany transactions might need to be at a leading level. But again, not every process needs to move that far. Bank reconciliation. This is something that I see clients struggle with all the time because it's a huge effort, and everything around bank rec to book to bank and any kind of recon, lots of times, or used to involve a lot of manual effort and a lot of people. And ERP systems and TMS systems have really changed a lot of that by implementing technology and functionality that really can push the needle. Again, to develop a design, you're going to need input from your owners, performers. You're going to have an understanding of the metrics. How many exceptions and are you willing to have in your system, right? Are you managing 50% exceptions and automating 50%, or do you want to get to a 70, 80, 90% auto recon and have the rest be exceptions management, right? These are all things to think about. Trade execution, if you're a smaller organization, maybe executing trades is something that it stays very manual. You have different terminals that you execute trades on, and that's it, But once you find systems out there that can maybe handle trade execution, you might start thinking about implementing functionality or onboarding functionality. These things can really help push the needle, right? But again, you need to have the people that know a lot about exposure management and risk management to be in charge and even execute trade execution, right? So those things are extremely important. So debt and investment accounting. You know, again, you might be at a functional level, and this might be something that is pretty, is not that critical, because ultimately you don't have a lot of debt and investment accounting activity. But ultimately, if you're scaling and you're growing, that might have to change. And then ultimately, another thing that comes up many times with trade execution, debt and investment, is that the regulatory environment dictates where you need to be and what standards you need to implement. And if you don't have those standards documented and set up, then that really can be an issue. So finally, you know, dashboard analytics reporting, this is just an example. Again, you might be at a functional level, but as technology improves, ultimately you can increase this and really push the needle on this. So the process maturity equation. And so finally, I want to kind of discuss some of the best practices and things that you can kind of walk away with for this presentation. And hopefully this was very informative and valuable. So best practices equals successful strategic planning. I'm pretty obvious right there. But I want you to walk away with a few, kind of a list of things that you can do or take away with today. And so really, when we talk about process maturity and how it relates to strategic planning, really we want to have, we want to define business objectives and set deadlines. So you don't want to just quickly evaluate things. You want to actually set objectives and deadlines for each approach that you're going to take when you're looking at strategic planning, but also when you're doing a process maturity. You know, another thing that I think is very very critical is you need to specify tactical and strategic approaches to meet those objectives. So setting objectives is fine, but you need to let everyone know how you're going to get there and what you're going to do. Identifying KPIs that will be used to ensure that those strategies are meeting expectations. So again, just like any process that we discussed, one of the enablers was metrics, right? For just setting these objectives for strategic planning and process maturity, you need to have something in place that can actually measure that. So measure, and then ultimately then measure your current performance for each process and the maturity level of each enabler. So again, how, with those metrics, those KPIs, figure out where you're at with your processes, and then, you know, look at each enabler and see where it falls. Decide the required maturity level of each enabler associated with each process. This will allow the process to meet its desired performance. Yeah, so you have to ultimately make a decision where you want to be, right? Otherwise, otherwise you can't really start. Analyze the results of your maturity assessment. Each process should have a strategic plan in place. So again, you got results, but now you have to actually create a plan, define the plan for each process. You know, organizational level planning, absolutely, but for each one of these processes, you should have some plan set in place. Yep, and create a holistic plan and act, right? So get a full plan together and start. I mean, ultimately, that's the most difficult part I see, but that's what needs to happen. So the equation, what's the equation that that I'm trying to push here is that you figure out the solution for your pain points, and that translates to some kind of, current state assessment of some level, right? Um, then you can identify process maturity improvements, and those two elements ultimately drive successful strategic planning. And so that's ultimately the best practice approach on how to get to successful strategic planning. And so with that, I am going to open it up to some questions.
We do have a couple that came through here, Edmund. So it says, during these engagements, and I'm assuming it's referring to the use cases, were performers included from the beginning of the project planning and development? If not, when do you typically bring in performers into a project?
That's a great question. And so I would say not. So first, we need to engage. Basically assess who and what resources are going to be involved, right? So I would say we engage them very early on and keep them informed of what is happening and what we're doing. But they don't need to be engaged during every stage of an engagement, right? There's a lot of tools out there that can do this. We use a RACI, where we identify right off the bat who's responsible, who's accountable for the different processes, and who should be informed. And a lot of times, we won't engage the performers necessarily until we set up workshops, as an example. But that really comes down to the need of the project and where we want to go. If the project is going to be really focused on training, and we know that right away, we might engage performers and owners, early on. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And another one, since we're talking about enablers already, is one of the five enablers more important than the others?
That's a good question. It kind of seems like there might be, but the answer is no. They aren't. They're all equally important. And obviously, there might be more emphasis on focusing on one. At least when you look at maybe implementing a technology solution. So ultimately, you think of infrastructure as the technology piece, and that's the priority. But the reality is that all of them are equally as important. And if you want to see true performance for your treasury processes increase, you don't just implement a TMS system with a ton of new functionality. You also identify who's going to be in that TMS system. You're going to train those people. You have to identify who's accountable for those systems. And you need to ultimately measure how you're doing in that system. And so that's why, and again, none of that can be done without a design, right? So that's why all those enablers really feed off of each other and really drive that process that you're trying to improve. Thank you.
We have one more here. Do I have to do a process maturity before I do my technology implementation?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So the answer is no, you don't have to do that. A lot of engagements, so a few things there. A lot of engagements, we would do something like that in parallel or in the beginning, right? I don't think you need to do it before. There's a lot of, implementing something or around Treasury, there might be a lot of design sessions, that type of stuff. You can do the process maturity in parallel. I mean, something to keep in mind that process maturity is a tool that goes into your analysis and strategic planning. It's not a standalone project or thing you implement. You want to use this tool to drive your analysis for strategic planning. And that's ultimately going to drive how you implement a solution. So that's really what you want to focus on. And it's actually interesting. I've seen a lot of I've seen clients come to us where there was not a high level of analysis, and definitely not any process maturity done prior to implementing. And then they ultimately ended up with a solution that didn't quite meet all the requirements and didn't quite meet the expectations of the owners, um, in those processes. So that's where you can see a lot of benefit if you do this in the beginning of an implementation or before an implementation. You can see a lot of benefits.
Thank you, Edmund. So it looks like that is the end of our Q&A right now. A couple of closing remarks, as this is the last of our educational sessions for the ETE conference. We do still have another product demo for Oracle Cloud Cache Management at 2 p.m. Central. A few reminders, the ETE library will be available next week with session recordings, with PDF versions of the presentations, as well as links to those CTP CCM credit assessments. The one for this session was just added to the chat. We will also be sending out a post-event survey to hear your feedback, so please take 5 minutes, fill that out in the coming weeks for future ETE conferences. I want to thank Edmund for his time today, as well as everyone for joining this afternoon, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate everyone joining. Thank you, Jordan.